particular presentation that we're about to have with Ralph Wechsler is going to be interesting in the sense that we have talked so much about Peter Ossorio, and some of us had the pleasure and honor and privilege of working with him years and years ago, but many people have not. And I think that this, to me, it's quite interesting to find out from Ralph what exactly it was like to actually work with him in depth, because that's what he did with his dissertation. So let me introduce Dr. Ralph Wechsler, received his PhD under Peter Ossorio in 1983. He's had a long career as a staff psychologist in the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Denver, where he's extensively treated veterans with PTSD, as well as working in the Psychiatric Emergency Service, Administrative Director of Inpatient Mental Health Services, Director of Psychological Training, and Aftercare Coordinator of PTSD Residential Rehabilitation and Treatment Program. In addition to all this, he also has a private practice in Denver, in which he treats adults and adolescents and does clinical and forensic psychological evaluations and consultations. Dr. Wechsler is a longtime society member, well known for his work in understanding and treating PTSD. During this conference, we've referred many times to Pete, and we're going to hear something about what it was like to work with him as he presents My Dissertation Journey with Pete Ossorio, a personal and conceptual story. Dr. Wechsler.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my screen. There we go. My presentation today will describe the lived experience of completing a doctoral dissertation on the personality characteristics of manics with the founder of Descriptive Psychology, Dr. Peter G. Ossorio. Oh, let me just get my slideshow going here. There we go. I'll be making use of a verbatim transcript of my doctoral supervision to show the highlights and the lowlights of the journey. I don't know how representative my journey was for doctoral dissertations in general, but I suspect that what I say today will bring back memories for others who did their doctoral work with Professor Ossorio, hereafter referred to as Pete. Even if you did not do a dissertation with him, many of you will recognize him in what I share. For those of you in the audience today who never had the opportunity to meet Pete, or whose exposure to descriptive psychology is relatively recent, I sincerely hope that you'll be able to glean some sense of both from today's presentation. I'll be sharing a number of excerpts from my transcript that I believe will convey both Pete's wisdom and his nature. Why a transcript? Time with Pete was precious, so you had to make the most of it. I should note that my first entry is dated July 20th, 1981, and apparently took place at a Denny's restaurant in Boulder. If you work with Pete, you know that you met with him whenever his schedule allowed. In my case, doctoral supervision took place every Monday night from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. in his office in the Munziger Psychology Building on the University of Colorado campus. By this point in my graduate school career, I had learned very well, and I'm gonna, I think, stop screen sharing for the moment and go full screen for me. Can everybody see me okay? Okay, let me just expand my Zoom screen. And
I love that picture of you from back then.
yeah, that's my student ID. By this point in my graduate school career, I had learned very well that I could not fully absorb in real time all that Pete said to me. To maximize my comprehension, I started tape recording each meeting and then transcribing it over the next 2 weeks. These efforts allowed me to ponder what he said and to grasp a much deeper level what he was trying to convey. I'd also heard stories from my fellow graduate students about Pete's tendency to change things up on them. For example, he would tell students to do something one way and then later tell them to do it a completely different way, which could be quite frustrating and even crazy making. So an added benefit of the transcript was being able to point out to Pete when he seemed to be contradicting himself. Of course, some of the changes and reversals that Pete made were deliberate and very well considered. I'm going to say a word about doctoral dissertations from a historical perspective. Back in the day, 40 years ago, there were few resources for psychology graduate students faced with the daunting challenge of completing a doctoral dissertation, other than Strunk White's 1923 treatise entitled The Elements of Style and the publication manual of the American Psychological Association. Of course, there were some technical books to guide you, such as Sidney Siegel's 1956 volume, Non-Parametric Statistics for the Behavioral Sciences. But there were no practical resources like the book entitled, let me go back to screen sharing here. The book entitled Dissertations and Theses from Start to Finish, Psychology and Related Fields, which was first published by the American Psychological Association in 1990. The third edition was published in 2020. I was struck by the author's commentary on how much things have changed in the field. They write, "It's been almost 30 years since we first conceived this book. When we started the first edition, students often began graduate school with minimal formal research experience. The thesis or dissertation may have been based on their first independent research projects, and these projects were often their primary, if not only, major research endeavors during graduate school. In addition, most students relied largely on the professor who chaired their thesis or dissertation for guidance on these projects. Times have changed. Today, it's much more common for students to have considerable research experience by the time they get to the thesis or dissertation. For many, it is no longer the first project or the pinnacle of the graduate years. For these students, thesis or dissertation may feel like just another project in their evolving program of research requiring skills they've already developed or at least observed in their lab mates. In addition, the number of resources available to support thesis and dissertation writing has exploded since the first edition of our book, including everything from online resources such as websites, blogs, and YouTube videos, to articles and books on the topic, to thesis and dissertation coaches, and writing services. There are now journal articles and books, often discipline specific, that address certain aspects of graduate level research projects. For example, selection of a topic, organization for writing, time management, self-care. My research experiences before the dissertation. My dissertation experience was truly of the old school variety. And I'm going to stop sharing here momentarily. At CU, I did my first year research apprenticeship with Professor Bill Hodges, which was an observational study on the effects of divorce on the preschool child. My second year research apprenticeship was with Professor Vic Ryan on a study I developed examining the effects of fees on the process and outcome in psychotherapy. I made use of the fortuitous circumstance that the Victor Ramey Psychology Clinic in the department had recently started charging fees. I had a natural experiment with both fee-paying and non-fee-paying clients in the clinic. The project proved to be an out-of-control behemoth that produced the data for two other graduate students' second-year research projects as well as my own. I recall staring at my data and asking myself, quote, "What's the research question to which this data is the answer?" I had approached the research enterprise entirely, shall I say, ass backwards. Clearly, I was ill prepared for the rigors of a descriptive psychology dissertation or the challenges of a clinical topic like mania. Getting started clinically. My interest in mania derived from my clinical experiences at Boulder Mental Health Center, where I encountered acutely ill manics on the emergency psychiatric service on their way to hospitalization, and then treated quote unquote recovered manics as outpatients on the intensive treatment team. Initially, I was struck by the primacy of biological factors in the condition, as I witnessed such deranged behavior in the individuals I was hospitalizing and such seemingly quote unquote normal individuals after hospital discharge. I had concluded if there ever was a case of a biologically determined mental illness, it was bipolar disorder. Over time, however, my clinical experiences began to challenge my exclusively biological determinism. I began to notice similarities in the personality characteristics of the patients I was treating during their so-called euthymic or normal mood phase. These characteristics included many narcissistic traits and an exquisite vulnerability to quote unquote narcissistic injury that seemed to bear some relation to the onset of frank manic episodes. In addition, I began to observe a different significance in the behaviors of the acutely ill manics. Instead of merely chaotic frenzy, I began to discern some, I dare say, method to the madness. With these ideas in mind, I started on a path towards a dissertation. Pete started by sharing with me the formulation of mania that he and Wynne Schwartz, a graduate student several years ahead of me in the program, had worked on. The formulation describes how a loss of status is unthinkable for the manic. And here I'm referring to a more encompassing notion of one's place or fundamental standing in the world, not the narrower notion of merely one's social status. The manic episode is a manifestation of the manic's desperate efforts to sustain his or her status, albeit unrealistically, in an escalating spiral of failing self-affirmations. The key issues are the manic's fundamental intolerance of status loss, i.e. degradation, and, as I came to see, that the manic's mood is in harmonious representation with the distorted cognitions about himself and his place in the world, not merely an effect of the general mood state or specifically euphoria. The distinctions provided by descriptive psychology concepts offered a compelling way of seeing and describing the clinical phenomenon in front of me. As Pete said to me once, calling mania mood disorder is like calling a whale a fish. Doing a doctoral dissertation Pete's way. Again, I'm going to shift over to screen share here. There we go. Pete's instructions on doing a dissertation came in the form of a simple outline where he detailed the steps in writing the dissertation proposal that he handed me at one of our early meetings. Here you can see a picture of the original document that he handed me. As with many things Pete did, he distilled the process to its essence. I'll use the outline today to traverse the dissertation journey. In the next slide, I've reproduced more legibly what Pete listed in the handout. Looks pretty simple and straightforward, doesn't it? Areas to be covered in a proposal. 1, identify important area or problem. 2, review state of art with respect to that problem. 3, evaluate state of the art and decide what problems remain. 4, introduce your views regarding remaining problems. 5, introduce your contributions to their solutions. Introduce your conceptualization here. 6, refine that formulation into specific hypotheses. 7, procedures. 8, restate each hypothesis along with each a prediction. Hypotheses are stated in conceptual terms and predictions are stated in data terms. 9, specify how data will be analyzed. 10, what differential conclusions will be drawn on the data? For example, accept hypotheses if predictions are correct. I won't go into great detail today on steps 1 to 4 due to time constraints. They are spelled out in the chapter I wrote for the 1991 edition of Advances in Descriptive Psychology entitled Personality in Manic States, a Status Dynamic Formulation of Bipolar Disorder. The paper is available on the Society's website. Instead, I will focus initially on the process of refining the conceptualization and then speak about the research design that emerged. The challenge of reviewing the literature for the proposal. And I'm going to stop screen sharing again, get back to me. I recall Pete saying, if you don't screw around with a proposal, it's very doable. Of course, that proved easier said than done. I flailed around for a considerable time with the challenge of writing a proposal, repeatedly asking Pete various questions like, do I review the research on X? And do I review the literature on Y? He patiently said, no, you write a proposal. Each of my inquiries was followed by the same refrain from Pete, no, you write a dissertation proposal. Finally, he said to me something that penetrated my obtuseness. You don't do something by doing something else. At that moment, I realized that you don't do a proposal by reviewing the literature on X or Y. You write the proposal. And in the process, it will be clear what literature you need to review, not the other way around. A literature review will not write a dissertation proposal. That simple statement has stuck with me for a lifetime and been shared countless times with friends, family, and supervisees. Throughout our work together, Pete also challenged my obsessional tendency to think about doing things instead of actually doing them. I am sad to say, however, these tendencies are still alive and were evidenced in full force as I procrastinated my preparation on this very presentation. As a friend who's known me since 7th grade said, "Ralph, you are procrastination royalty." Pete did have some thoughts on literature reviews that are worth sharing. He said, "Well, keep pursuing this thing and do the literature review last, because you can do a summary of the literature for a proposal." The main reason for the literature review, the two main reasons, one is that there's a myth that you build on what other people have done. And that really is mostly myth, because usually when you do some research, you want to know what other people have done, but you're not building on what's there. You've just got an alternative. The other is to make sure that nobody has done what you're proposing to do. And since there's very little possibility of that sort, i.e. with the mania formulation, you really don't need the literature review in order to do the whole thing. But since it's a part of the tradition, you have to have something. Selecting a dissertation committee. Pete offered sage advice on selecting faculty for your dissertation committee. Formerly at the University of Colorado, the committee consisted of the chairman, 2 faculty within the clinical psychology area, 1 faculty member outside of clinical, but within the psychology department, for example, social, experimental, etc., and 1 faculty member from a department other than psychology. People often take the approach of populating their committee with faculty who have some particular expertise germane to the dissertation topic or research methods. For example, if I'm doing factor analysis, then I should have a faculty member who specializes in factor analysis. If I'm examining anxiety states, I should have a faculty member whose area of clinical expertise or research focus is anxiety. Pete's advice was contrarian, as he was on many things. He said, "The basic guideline is whoever you get along with and whoever is interested, because you don't want guys with ideology who are going to insist that you do it their way. And the main place you find that is with the methodology, the guys who are the statisticians, the measurement guys. They're the ones who give you a hard time. Did you use this procedure, etc.? That's one of the places. Surprisingly enough, another is the experts. They are the ideologues. They don't want to see their theories challenged, much less overthrown, and they will give you a hard time. So you want to avoid those kinds of hassles." I came to appreciate his wisdom as I saw other graduate students struggle with their committee members or heard about how the committee members locked horns with each other. I selected for people who knew Pete and could appreciate both him and the descriptive psychology as a discipline. The 2 committee members from the clinical area were Don Weatherly and Louise Silver. The member from psychology, but outside of the clinical area, was a social psychologist, John Forward, who eventually became a member of the Society for Descriptive Psychology. The final member from outside of the psychology department was Forrest Williams, a professor in the philosophy department whose specialty was French existentialism. Together, they offered wise counsel and strong support throughout the dissertation process. Refining the conceptualization. Many of our early discussions in dissertation supervision focused on a review of status dynamics, which systematically examines the fundamental relationships between the concepts of person, behavior, and world. For anybody in the audience unfamiliar with status dynamics, I'll be glad to share the summary of status dynamics I recently rediscovered in the appendix of my dissertation. Our discussions then drilled into the various descriptive psychology concepts relevant specifically to the conceptualization of mania. These concepts included, to name just a few, the notions of behavior potential, self-concept, impossible worlds, unthinkability and insistence, pathological states, accreditation and degradation, and the difference between the description of a condition and the explanation of the condition. As I sought to sharpen my understanding of descriptive psychology concepts in general and status dynamics in particular, what frequently came across Pete's face can only be described as a pained look, something I'm sure many of you are familiar with. What inevitably followed was Pete's patient correction of my misunderstandings through extended dialogue and multiple examples. The degradation of these moments was almost entirely self-generated. They rarely came from Pete. These discussions about basic descriptive psychology concepts helped me assimilate them at a far deeper level than at any point thus far in my graduate career. One of the key conceptual issues we had to address was the relationship between biological and psychological perspectives on mania. I will share the introductory paragraph of my dissertation. I quote, "The notion of a mental disorder immediately becomes problematic when the distinction between mind and brain is introduced. Issues of reification and reductionism arise, and what seems to emerge is a quote unquote mixed metaphor of sorts. Manic depressive disorder clearly illustrates this. Description on a physiological level is put in opposition to description on a psychological level. At least historically, one of the other types of explanation / description has been given precedence with accompanying denigration of the other. The emphasis at present is on the physiological level. What is needed is more adequate conceptualization at the psychological level, with an overt acknowledgement of the complementarity of the physiological level of description. What follows will be an attempt to do just that, to develop a conceptualization that is consistent with the facts of persons and behavior that are observed for the condition called mania. No attempt will be made to solve the mind-body problem. Instead, an approach will be taken that simply says that such a problem exists if you wish to create one by failing to see the relativity of conceptual frameworks. I thought this exchange between Pete and I, where I played devil's advocate, would be illustrative of his approach to biological explanations in the behavioral realm. Pete: "Well, the other thing I find effective is just to take a hard-boiled stance and say, that sounds pretty mystical to me. Can you show me some hard data instead of this fancy invention of hypothetical possibilities?" Me: "Well, look how effective lithium is." Pete: "Yeah, but how is lithium effective? What does lithium do that makes it effective?" Me: "Well, you see, when we give it to manics, we find that 70 to 80% of them no longer have episodes, or they have episodes that are significantly attenuated in severity." Pete: "How does it work?" Me: "We put it in their mouths, they swallow it, and we keep their blood level of 1.2. Pete: "Yeah. And how does that make a difference in their manic state?" Pete: "That's why the bully example is nice. You see, if indeed you manacle a kid's hands behind his back, that offsets his superior size, and he's not going to find it an easy time being a bully. And if you do something chemically, i.e. with lithium, to slow down that rate of transmission, then it's not as easy to have a flight of ideas." He'd also shared a bit of personal history on this issue after I asked him, "You told me that you started off by going the route of neurophysiology?" Pete: "Not quite. I was interested in it, and at one time I knew a fair amount about it, but the field has changed since then. I've got nothing against physiology at all. I prefer to see it done by biologists rather than by biologists who call themselves psychologists. I would rather have it recognized as biology rather than all of these goddamn polemics about that's what psychology really is." And I'm going to go back to screen sharing here. The fundamental notion in our conceptualization was that manics are people for whom a loss of status is unthinkable, and we generated the following hypotheses. Number one, manics will be less inclined to imagine a loss of status, i.e. a degradation occurring. Two, manics will be more reactive to changes in status, i.e. degradation and or accreditation. Three, manics will prefer the being aspects of status over the doing aspects of statuses. Four, manics will be more reactive to a lowered status, i.e. a degraded one. Five, manics will be less inclined to claim a degraded status and or more inclined to claim an accredited status. Our challenge was to identify ways in which this personal characteristic, i.e. the unthinkability of status loss, would be demonstrated behaviorally through experimental tasks in our manic subjects. Of course, we could have just let the Human Subjects Committee be damned and simply degraded the manic subjects in our experimental procedures and see if that prompted a manic episode. Obviously, that wasn't an ethical solution. So we had the daunting task of coming up with some ways of tapping into manic's personal characteristics that were safe, yet powerful enough to show differences between our experimental subjects and our control groups. That required creating experimental situations many steps removed from the actual phenomenon posited in conceptualization, but sensitive enough to show the differences that we were seeking in our experimental groups. I should probably mention the makeup of our final subject groups in the study. The experimental group consisted of 12 men and 10 women who were outpatients at Boulder County Mental Health Center. They had to meet the DSM-3 diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder and were in remission. A neurotic comparison group was included in the study to assist in determining whether any differences found between the experimental and control groups could be attributed to the manic's character per se, or whether they were simply the effects of being a psychiatric patient. The comparison group consisted of 10 women and 10 men who were outpatients at Boulder County Mental Health Center and exhibited a neurotic level of disturbance according to the DSM-3. The normal control group consisted of 13 men and 13 women from the Boulder, Colorado community at large, solicited by an advertisement placed in the local newspaper. Of course, one can argue whether 26 Boulder residents accurately sampled the population of quote unquote normal people. The challenge of operationalization. We struggled to find operationalizations where the presumed personal characteristic, an inability to tolerate status loss in certain domains of a person's world can be expressed in some fashion. Again, Pete commented. The odd thing about the conceptualization is it's quite distinctive, but it's hard to think of good empirical tests. There's a big gap between how different manics sound conceptually and where you can do something to get the visible evidence. You're trying to say that there's something that somebody can't do, which is not as easy as showing that there's something that they can do. And where what they can't do is as non-performative as not being able to stand degradation, then believe you do have problems. We settled on tapping into the judgment tendencies as expressions of manic's personal characteristics instead of actual behaviors that connected more directly to the formulation. I wanted to share some more of Pete's dialogue on this fundamental challenge. Pete, that's why you go for personal characteristics rather than behaviors, etc., because personal characteristics are stable and you can tap them at any time. With behaviors, you may need to set up a special situation before you pull the behaviors. And the intermediate is judgment behavior, where you stage set a hypothetical and get a judgment. The judgment tendencies are stable, like personal characteristics, but they're close enough to actual behavior so you can draw pretty much the same conclusions as you could if you saw the actual behavior. Pete went on to say, yep, you see, that's the kind of thing that goes into the derivation from the conceptualization. You say, well, here are these guys who really are unable, strongly unable, although not absolutely, to take seriously, and I mean by that, treat as a real possibility, the possibility of degradation of themselves. So they are people who tend to think in terms of the possibilities of degradation, and even when it isn't themselves. Since they don't, they are less likely to use that notion in their dealings with things, in their dealings with people, in their dealings with pictures, in their dealings with anything. So on an imaginal task, where they have a chance to introduce degradation or not, they are less likely to do that than the normal subjects are. I won't go into all of the 5 hypotheses and diverse operationalizations we developed to test them. Instead, I will briefly mention the operationalization for our first hypothesis and then focus on the third hypothesis. For hypothesis 1, which proposes that, let me just go back. Well, it doesn't matter. Which proposes that manics will be less inclined to imagine a loss of status, our primary operationalization was a task that involves showing subjects various pictures from the thematic apperception test, and then asking them to complete a story step. And this picture is the first card actually in the thematic apperception test. And here's an example of one of the story stems we provided. This young boy has just given his first solo recital, solo violin recital, and his teacher and his friends and his relatives were all in the audience listening to him play. Now he's sitting by himself in a dressing room, thinking over how it went. He's practiced a long time for this day, and now it's over with. How did his performance go, and what is he thinking and feeling? The stories the subjects told were recorded, transcribed, and then rated as to how much accreditation and degradation the subject spontaneously portrayed in the story. There were also supplementary ratings, such as how much a subject liked a particular story. On other experimental tasks, we did things like systematically portray descriptions of individuals with accredited and degraded statuses and asked for ratings of various sorts or who they would choose to role play. I'm going to focus on the operationalization of my third hypothesis in more detail because it connects so directly to other descriptive psychology notions. This hypothesis was derived from the following clinical observation about manic behaviors. A manic whose particular self-affirmation entails a claim of being a great NBA player is making statements to that effect to the person on the next bar stool or to the bartender. That person is not out on the basketball shooting hoops and showing his great stuff to the other players on the court. In effect, he's invested in being a great basketball player, not in doing what a great basketball player would do. This hypothesis was an attempt to capture this notion that manics are invested in the being rather than the doing aspects of statuses. This distinction between being and doing comes directly from the heuristic image of the two mayors. I'll quote the two mayors image from Ossorio's 1976 volume entitled Clinical Topics. Now imagine yourself as a newspaper reporter who's going around interviewing candidates for mayor. And there's two candidates and you go to interview both of them. So you go to the first one and you say, hey, Mr. Jones, you know mayors do A, B, C, and D, and E. Are you that anxious? Are you that eager to do these things that you're putting out all of this effort and spending all this money to get yourself elected? And he says, well, of course. Why else would I do that? So you say, well, I can understand that. And you go away. You go to the next one and you put the same question to him. You say, hey, Mr. Smith, you know mayors do A, B, C, D, and E. Are you that eager to do those things that you're breaking your neck and putting out all this effort to try and get yourself elected? And he says, oh, no, I'd have my assistant do that. I just want to be mayor. And you say, well, I can understand that. And you go away. And the moral is you can understand that it does make sense for somebody just to want to be mayor and not care that much about doing what mayors do. In our discussion of this aspect of manic behaviors, Pete noted, it directs your attention to the being and doing contrast, the two mayors. It's a paraphrase or almost literally. The manic character is someone who wants to be somebody. It's unthinkable for him not to be somebody. And he doesn't care boo about doing the things that being that somebody calls for, or that getting to be that somebody calls for. He's invested in being somebody. You see, that gives you some clues because you can incorporate these kinds of contrasts into some experimental materials. So going back, this is an elaboration of my third hypothesis. Given that a loss of status is unthinkable, a manic will try to avoid such a loss by attempting to quote unquote be somebody with more status. These self-affirmations consist primarily of having a certain status, or in other words, of being somebody with particular tastes, values, aspirations, etc. Only secondarily is the manic invested in doing what it would take actually to validate that status. For the manic, the membership aspects of a status count for more than do the performance aspects. Therefore, manics will prefer the being aspects of a status over the doing aspects of statuses more than normals. The materials for this task, our operationalizations, what was called the being doing activity rating. The materials for this task consisted of 10 statuses referred to as occupations, and the list of 5 activities for each that someone with that status might engage. 8 high statuses: police officer, college professor, banker, lawyer, minister, architect, army captain, and airplane pilot. And 2 low statuses: filling station attendant, and taxi driver were presented to the subjects. They were asked to imagine they actually had each status and then rate how enjoyable they would find each activity on a 9-point enjoyableness rating scale ranging from not at all, 1, to extremely 9. For each status, 2 of the activities were predominantly from the being perspective and emphasized simply having a certain status. In other words, being activities involve the membership aspects of a status, being someone with values, tastes, and aspirations which reflected having that status. 2 of the activities for each status were predominantly from the doing perspective and emphasized actually enacting the status or validating it by doing the tasks of the status. In other words, doing activities involve more of the performance aspects of the status, doing what someone with that status routinely does as part of being in that position. The 5th activity for each status was a neutral activity, chosen to incorporate a balance of being and doing aspects. A purpose of the 5th item was to help disguise the nature of the task by increasing the number of activities the subject responded to. And I'll give you some examples of the various statuses in the task. Police officer. Wearing a police officer's uniform, being. Writing arrest report, doing. Attending roll call at the beginning of the shift, neutral. Directing traffic at an intersection, doing. Having a cup of coffee with another officer at a diner, being. College professor. Giving a lecture, doing. Serving on a faculty committee that issues parking permits, being. Reading a newly published article in your field, neutral. Belonging to the faculty club, being. Preparing an outline for a course, doing. Banker. Belonging to the Chamber of Commerce, being. Reviewing the bank's balance sheets for the month, doing. Opening the bank in the morning, neutral. Financial planning with the bank's accountant, doing. Having free access to the bank's vault, being. A key component for the data analysis of the subject's being and doing activity scores was a blue ribbon panel's ratings of how much each activity was a being or doing activity. These ratings were used in the scoring and interpretation of the data. The notion of a blue ribbon panel has its roots in Pete's work on expert judgments and classification-based methodologies. My panel ultimately consisted of volunteers from the 1983 meeting of the Society for Descriptive Psychology who were familiar with the being-doing distinction. My next section is entitled The Drama of Data Collection. Pete knowingly put a lot of pressure on me to have my data collection completed before I went on internship. The following captures our dialogue at this stage of the dissertation process as I prepared to leave for my pre-doctoral internship that started on July 1st, 1982. Me. I'm not sure I'm going to have time to collect my data. Pete. You better make a concerted effort. You have no idea how much difference this will make to your peace of mind and your odds of getting through in a decent period of time. Collect it now. Me. Well, the other issue, though, is my peace of mind of being able to get out of town into New Haven. Pete. Forget it. Collect your data. It's more important. Me. The getting out of town with peace of mind? Pete. Collecting your data is one of your big watersheds because after that, it just depends on you. It's a great comfort. Whereas if you don't, you have to go through a whole fucking bureaucratic procedure and setting up things and doing this, that, and the other. And it's going to compete with the demands on your time. And people always underestimate those demands. And they almost never collect data on their internship because of it. Me. Because the people there don't give a shit about your dissertation. They just want to see you getting those test reports in on time. Pete, that's right. So it's worth almost anything to get your data collected before you go. Unsurprisingly, I failed to collect the data before I left on internship. Therefore, I'm incredibly grateful for my 2 research assistants who gathered my data during my internship year. One was a colleague at Boulder Mental Health Center, Patricia Van Horn, who collected the data from the clinical subjects. The other was an undergraduate, Preet Berlin, who collected the data from my control group. Without their inestimable help, a data collection in absentia would not have been possible. And the narrative I am relating today might have had a very different ending. I could have been Ralph Wechsler, ABD, instead of Ralph Wechsler, Ph.D. Data analysis and deadlines and data analysis, dual crises. When I returned from internship in 1983, I resumed my meetings with Pete. However, instead of fully devoting myself to the dissertation, I blithely spent the remainder of the summer riding my road bike around the foothills of Boulder and working as a laborer for my friend's construction company. When September arrived, I went into full panic mode and did virtually nothing for the next 2.5 months. What cut my procrastination short was the fact that my doctoral candidacy would run out by the end of the year. I was faced with the prospect of retaking my comprehensive exams to reinstate my candidacy, something infinitely worse than whatever would be required to get the dissertation done. Data analysis was the nadir of my dissertation experience. I am not quantitatively inclined, and this disinclination was evident early in my graduate school career. Instead of taking the standard graduate statistics sequence taught in the psychology department with the formidable experimental psychologist David Chizar, some of us qualitative wimps opted for what was known as baby statistics. Baby statistics was offered in the Department of Education and taught by the eminent Professor Gene Glass. In his classes, we actually learned methods and designs that seemed far better suited for the study of human beings. Dr. Chizar's paradigm seemed more suited to experiments with laboratory rats or pigeons. Thus, I approached my data with only a passing familiarity with things statistical, but nothing that approached competence. Pete, on the other hand, was totally in his element with the quantitative aspects of research. He loved non-parametric statistics, particularly the sign test. He said, "The sign test is my favorite test. It's the most interpretable, the most compelling." He also said, "Don't get hung up on the psychometrics. It's all bullshit." Pete's approach to statistics fits well with his approach to the dissertation enterprise. He believed that if you did your hard work on the conceptualization, then the predictions about the data from the hypothesis derived from the conceptualization could be very specific. Instead of complicated analysis of variance and other statistical techniques, he preferred the simple elegance of a priori t-tests on the differences in means to acquire interpretive power. In the end, Pete took mercy on me and helped me through the terrors of my data analysis, which was made infinitely more challenging by the sex and other effects the data revealed. For example, he helped me write equations to create a set of corrected scores for my entire data set. And here you can see a sketch that Pete did on data, and here's a computer printout with some of his writings on it. Interpreting the data. Before we had the data fully in hand, Pete made the following predictions. Pete, I predict you get results. The only reason you wouldn't is if you screwed up on the detail work, on the items, on the adjustments or something, and it doesn't strike me you did that bad on that. Me, well, I can see some places where I could have. Pete, well, you always do, but you've got enough different things, so it's hard to imagine that you missed it. Unlucky in all of them. I, on the other hand, was not so sanguine, as can be seen by my remark on the distance between the formulation itself and how any effects created by the operationalizations would manifest in the data. I said, I get the sense of a series of hoops that your experimental effect has to jump through. And by the time it jumps through the 11th hoop, here's your selection, here's your sex effects, it's the experimental effects, etc. You got this little effect that can barely crawl through the last hoop. In the final analysis, the results mostly did not come out to support our hypothesis. Pete thought our negative findings were due primarily to our operationalizations, not the fundamental conceptualization itself. Thus, the challenge remained of proving experimentally what we found supported in clinical observations. Pete's cogent analysis is provided in the extended discussion that follows. Ralph, why do you think it didn't come out? Pete, because in fact, the operationalizations didn't work. It might have, because they very often indirect things like that work very well. Between the sex differences, which kind of screwed things over, and the operationalizations, that pretty much wiped out the usefulness of the data as checks on the conceptualization. What it looks like is you're going to have to scratch around, either staying in the same genre, but finding stories and stuff that are clean and evoke what you want them to evoke. Or you're going to have to figure out other indicators, short of running these people through degradation ceremonies. You may also need to refine the conceptualization along the lines of the quote unquote last straw. Namely, how come not all apparent degradations have the effect? I don't think that's in your conceptualization. And the explanation on this thing says, quote, finding degradation unthinkable doesn't mean that you find every degradation unthinkable. You're not dealing with a simple absolute. If you take it as a simple absolute that this is unthinkable, then how come they ever think of it? How come they ever get depressed, etc.? The answer isn't that a simple absolute. The answer is that it isn't a simple absolute and it can change and so forth. So you need some further explication that when you say, here's somebody who finds degradation unthinkable, that doesn't mean that every single thing that formally counts as a degradation, they're going to find unthinkable. What they're going to find unthinkable is some totality of status and degradation and some explicit degradations that don't make that much difference. They don't make the difference between what's acceptable and what's unthinkable, whereas other things do, and even minor things can make that difference. That puts a lot of flexibility in the formulation, and it makes it more plausible. Pete, yeah, it's true to fact. You don't really think of this as an absolute like punching keys on a machine. It's kind of an overall status which you're dealing with if you're a person. That would really fit in with Manic's inability to articulate why he gets crazy. You can't articulate that kind of part-whole relationship or that kind of boundary condition or totality. It's something all of these chunks don't quite fit right, and you can't deal with them. What Pete said next is such a beautiful illustration of how he taught that I will quote it in its entirety. Pete said, my heuristic for that is, see that coat hanging over there? Now, if you reach over and adjust it a little bit, I won't be able to tell you what difference your adjustment made usually. It will look differently, and I can react to the way it looks, but I can't tell you what went into how come it looks that way, including the final adjustment you made in it that accounts for how it looks right now. And similarly with your world, things happen and you adjust your picture of the world, but it's hard to trace back how come. If you pick any feature of the world, it's hard to trace it back into how that feature is there. How come it's that way and not some other way? And all the more so if you take the whole world picture. How come it's that way and not some other way? You throw up your hands. So with your self-concept, which is the mirror image of the world, if you try to account for how come it's this way, how come it's the way it is, you're going to have trouble. It's simply not a simple issue. It's not a readily answered one. The final orals, the last hurdle. With the final orals imminent, Pete, of course, continued to offer wise counsel. Here are a couple of his examples. Pete, by the way, one of the hazards, if you don't give the committee a chance to ask some phony questions that you can easily field, they may ask you some difficult questions at the orals because they need to ask you some questions. If you don't give them some attractive ones that you can dispose of, they'll have to make up their own. Then a few days before the orals, as Pete and I were riding down the elevator in Munziger, I casually remarked, isn't it true that at this point the orals are pretty much pro forma and collegial? You've already done the work and they give you credit for the sweat equity. Pete's reply, most of the time it goes that way, but sometimes it doesn't. That's why I'm there, because I can tell the members of the committee to fuck themselves and you can't. Fortunately, the orals went well as one could hope, and I passed. The only glitch was a major ice storm later that day, which delayed people from showing up at the Boulder Hotel for the celebration. Of course, I found a way to amuse myself in the mezzanine lounge until the party started. And here's the finished product. This is an old floppy disk from the word processor. And here, literally, my computer right now is stacked on 2 volumes, two copies of my dissertation. It weighs almost 6 pounds, and it's 2.5 inches thick. A lot of that is appendix because of the sex effects and a lot of data stuff in the back. Conclusions, looking back at the journey. What would I do differently? First, I would have done a better job of time management, availed myself of the deadlines he set for the various pieces of the dissertation. Second, as I look back to the lens offered by my professional career, I also wish I would have returned to the formulation and continued to work on the ways to validate it experimentally. Unfortunately, my managerial and other responsibilities in my VA career did not allow me the time or energy to do so. The clinical validation has persisted, however. In the cases of mania I encountered in my clinical work, in my therapy or assessment supervision with psychology interns, or from individuals who have family members with bipolar disorder with whom I have shared the formulation. What did I gain? Doing a descriptive psychology dissertation embodied the following status dynamic maxim. A person acquires concepts and skills by practice and experience. The immersive experience in descriptive psychology required by the dissertation process consolidated my understanding and was the foundation for the rest of my career as a descriptive psychologist. However, my dissertation journey was so much more than just an intellectual journey. It was a deeply personal one as well. I was afforded tremendous access to Pete, and I'm incalculably grateful for the opportunity to gain a deeper wisdom and friendship with him. It was life-changing, and he remains deeply missed.